All right, so I'm starting to see people jumping on to the line. As people are joining the room, I just want to take a moment to say good afternoon and welcome. For those of you that do not know me, my name is Warren Mabey and I am the director of the School of Policy Studies, and it is a pleasure to introduce you to this latest in our Policy Talks series. I'm going to just take a moment to acknowledge that I'm sitting here at Queen's University and we are situated on the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe peoples. It is a privilege for us to be able to work here and to study here and to learn here. Kingston or Cataraqui has been a place where people have come together for millennia to exchange ideas and to exchange goods. And I like to think that Queen's continues that tradition as a place where we can come together and exchange our thinking and our ideas. I want to also acknowledge that many of you in our online world are on different traditional territories. So please take a moment to think about that as we go forward. Before we jump into today's talk, I want to give you a heads up that we do have a couple of great talks coming up. Next week, we have two speakers on, I believe, February the 8th. We have Dan Brandt, who will be speaking about Indigenous governance. On February the 11th, we have a talk on electoral reform. And all of that is posted on our website. And I do encourage you to check out our website, the School of Policy Studies, and look at that series of talks. Always interesting things going on. So with that, I see that our attendance is starting to build up and I'm excited to see people online. I will remind you all that we are in a webinar format. We're recording the webinar and we have a Q&A function, which you can see at the bottom of your screen if you move your mouse around. This is how we encourage you to engage with our speaker. So I'm going to turn over to my colleague, Professor Kukreja from Global Development Studies to introduce our speaker for today. Over to you, Rena.
Thank you so much, Warren. Thank you, Anna, for agreeing to come on to be the speaker. It gives me a great pleasure to introduce to you all Dr. Anna Triandafyllidou. She's Canada Excellence Research Chair in Migration at Ryerson University, Toronto. She's also an internationally recognized sociologist and migration policy expert whose interdisciplinary research focuses on the governance of migration and asylum, the management of cultural diversity, nationalism and identity issues, and of course, contemporary challenges of migration and integration across different world regions. She's going to touch upon the messiness of migration processes in a moment from now. Prior to her CERC at Ryerson, she was based in Florence, Italy, where she held a Robert Schuman Chair at the European University Institute and directed the Cultural Pluralism research area as part of the European University Institute's Global Governance Program. She has held a number of offices and has served as national and international expert on migration policy for the Organization of Economic Cooperation, OECD, and has evaluated projects on migration for ministries and foundations such as the European Commission's Directorate General for the Migration and Home Affairs. I must say, if you look at her CV, it is quite dauntingly impressive. She has coordinated 30 international research projects in these research fields and has published more than 160 articles in refereed journals and chapters. And she has 6 authored books and 25 edited and co-edited books. She's also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Immigrant and Refugee Studies since 2013. Personally, I know Anna as a scholar who's amazingly generous with her time, her contacts, and just the willingness to listen, to speak about migration, or to share her expert expertise with other scholars such as myself whenever we have sought her out. I do not want to take more time listing her numerous achievements, including the wide range of projects that she's engaged in Ryerson at this moment. Before handing over the mic to Anna and wanting to hear what she has to speak, I just want to state that, please post your questions on the Q&A. I'm going to be moderating the questions once Anna finishes her talk, and we'll be fielding it on. You can, of course, type in your questions anytime during the talk, but do remember that we will address these once the talk is over. So without further ado, Anna, I want to hear what you have to say. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Irina. Thank you for having me and for inviting me. It's a bit of a disappointment I cannot be at Kingston at this moment. But of course, yeah, that's our condition, our pandemic condition. I want also to acknowledge that I'm connecting to the webinar from Toronto, which is the Dish with One Spoon territory. It's the ancestral land of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas, who are peoples that inhabited this land and had this idea. The dish with one spoon means the dish is our territory, our natural resources, and we all share with it with one spoon. So we have a responsibility to look after it and share, and settlers are welcomed in this land. And in that sense, I have to say I'm trying to grapple with my responsibilities as this. I'm a relatively newcomer to Canada. This is my third year in this great and vast country. So I'm really still grappling with my responsibilities, and coming from a university like Ryerson, which, as you know, is in the process of renaming. This is something that we really need to take action on. It's not just about words. Without further ado, yeah, it's wonderful to be with you in this seminar, and it is really so fascinating how Irina and I have connected on common research topics, which shows how much migration is a global thing, and we can talk about it in the discussion, because we share an interest in South Asian migrations in Southern Europe, particularly in relation to agriculture. So my talk today, let me share my screen. Yes. Yeah, so my talk today, here we are. My talk today, it's about the global governance of migration and what I call a messy approach. So let me start by saying a few things of how the talk is organized. So I want to discuss a little bit with you how migration is changing so how we need to relate actually migration to the wider social transformation processes that are taking place, how the global governance regime of migration is emerging, what is the wider context of global migration governance, and then how we make sense of these, like the change in socioeconomic and political context, globalization and migration, and how we try to govern migration. And I want to suggest, and it's quite timely, we're nearing 4 years at the end of 2022. We will be 4 years from the Global Compact's signature. So I want to raise some criticisms about this view of safe, orderly, and regular migration, and discuss how we can decenter migration governance, how we can understand systemic resilience in migration governance, and what does a messy approach look like, and why I think this is a better approach for making sense of how we govern migration. So when I speak about changing migrations, I'm reflecting on a question that is often addressed to me by friends or relatives who are not working on migration, and they will refer to either their own or their family's experience on migration, and they will have sometimes pro-migration views, many times anti-migration views. And I'm speaking perhaps not so much about Canada, but about my previous life in Italy and Greece and Belgium, etc. So that also prompted me quite early on to reflect, how are the migrations today different from those of the 90s? And these are different, again, from those of the post-war period. And I think there are many important features that we need to pay attention to when we try to both theorize about migration, but also make sense of how we govern it. And this is now we have moved, still after the World War II, post-colonial pathways were dominant. While today, and particularly I would say since the 90s, we're seeing new origins and new destinations. We're seeing a multiplication of the routes that migrants take. And for instance, we see people precisely from South Asia, from, for instance, Bangladesh, going to Italy already in the 90s and to Greece since the 2000s, countries that had no previous connection whatsoever among them. The other thing that we see is that mixed motivations are pervasive. And I want to say there that I'm not talking about mixed migration in the sense of asylum seekers and migrants traveling the same routes, but I'm talking about mixed motivations because I think that's more appropriate, so that people may have political reasons for migrating, so security reasons, like seeking security and protection, but they may also have economic reasons and they may have family reasons, and all these are usually amalgamated. And of course, we have some cases where people are fleeing war, so clearly there is a case for protection, but in some cases where people, say like me, decide to move to another country because they think that professionally it's better or for the future of their family, but there is a lot of in-between situations. And I think we need, I mean, we've seen this developing also in migration studies in the last years. When I started 25 years ago, like asylum was something that the international lawyers do, and migration was something that sociologists and political science study. And today it's really very much intertwined. The other thing that we've been seeing through this time is growing inequalities both within and among countries. And while of course like decolonization had, you know, and the formation of independent states in different world regions bore a big promise to it, we've seen that this has not resulted in a real undoing of structures of power and of inequality, of global inequality. And on top of that, what we see today is an increasingly integrated global economy where different countries plug themselves in different spots in this economy, in these global systems of production. And I think the pandemic has just highlighted how much we're dependent on these global value chains, where a product is, you know, is made in Italy, but actually has been produced in 3 different countries in 3 different world regions. And we've seen how much import and export and international trade is important for us. At the same time, we live, particularly in the last 20 years, into a really important, you know, actually a series of revolutions in what concerns advanced digital technologies. And particularly, I think the advent of the internet and then of the Internet of Things has made our communication very different. And we have seen also, of course, transport becoming much more accessible and much faster than it used to be. So migrations have been really globalizing and diversifying, new origins, new destinations, new routes, mixed motivations, constant communication, constant connectedness. And I think it also becomes very difficult, in my view, to distinguish voluntary from forced migration, or rather, it's not that we cannot, of course, there are degrees of voluntariness or degrees of being forced to leave that we should not ignore, but I think it's more a continuum rather than an on and off situation that we need to think about. Now, I want to turn towards speaking a little bit about the global compacts and the emerging global governance of migration. And I want to say, I believe most of you are a little bit familiar with the compacts. You know that there was a whole process, I think, that was started in the mid-2000s that culminated in the New York meetings of 2016, and then in the elaboration and signature of the Global Compact for Refugees and the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration at the end of 2018. And I think it was a very important exercise. It's better that we have the compacts than if we didn't have them. But at the same time, we cannot ignore that there is a domination of the destination countries and of West-centric approaches that is reflected in the compacts. And there is, particularly, I'm critical of the idea of safe, orderly, and regular migration, because I think a lot of migration happens in unsafe, disorderly, and irregular ways. And there is a risk that of course, we want migration to be safe. Of course, we want it to be regular and to be a triple win situation, or at least a double win of the migrant and the destination country. But probably also the origin country, but we should not actually stigmatize a migration that is not safe, orderly, and regular is bad migration, because this is, in my view, this is dangerous, and this is not the case. And also my reflection before was the compacts have, I mean, the negotiation towards the compacts also led to a clear distinction between refugees and migrants, and I think this is a problematic distinction, while of course I'm aware that we don't want to take anything away from the global asylum regime. And the other thing that I want to say, and I want to come back to in the future slides, is that we live today in a totally different world compared to the world of 2016, 17, or 18 because of the pandemic. So we've seen a lot of our predictions about a world of hypermobility being shattered by the pandemic, and at the same time we've seen such an increased level of digital connectedness and digital mobility that we really need to rethink, are the compacts fit for purpose? Let me, however, turn to the geopolitical context of the 20th century. I already spoke about how migrations have changed, but I think we need to also understand the broader geopolitical context. Obviously, the implosion of the communist regimes and the end of Cold War in 1989 and through the 90s, the emergence of a multipolar world, important economies and societies around the world are challenging whatever we can call the West, or if you want, Europe and North America, and their dominance in politics, like in the global economy. We've seen also, for what concerns migration, the emergence of regional governance and enhanced regional mobility regimes. The obvious example here is the European Union. And for those who are not very familiar with the EU, I just want to say EU member states resemble almost Canadian provinces. So it's not, okay, the EU is not a federal state, but there are a lot of things, particularly for what concerns circulating, establishing yourself in another country, working there, the common currency, transferability of welfare. There's a lot of commonality. So it's truly an enhanced mobility regime. But often we forget that something similar is happening in Mercosur, in Latin America. And there is also an emerging such system with the ECOWAS, in the West African region. So regional mobility regimes are important when we're thinking of how to regulate migration, and they have been really emerging very insignificant ways in the last 20 years. Then, in terms of our connectedness, we cannot ignore how much civil society is transnationalizing. Perhaps we saw this first after the global financial crisis, but we also saw it in the Arab Spring in 2011. We've seen it in the Fridays for Future that were, again, very vocal before the pandemic, kind of overshadowed our concerns with climate change, or at least our mobilization for climate change. I think we've seen it also, 2 years ago with the Black Lives Matter movement, and how this is, or we can see it now with the anti-vax movement. So I think these are important elements that we need to keep in mind when we're thinking about global migration governance, and when we try to think of resilient governance, which is what I'm going to talk about next. So actually what I'm presenting today is a bit of a work in progress, because I have written and published already my thinking about, messy governance, but what I'm decentering migration governance, but I'm trying to carry this thinking further in terms of what does a resilient and sustainable governance of migration look like, particularly as we hopefully leave the pandemic behind us. And I see a few elements important there. One is that the need to decenter, and I will analyze this in a moment. The need to acknowledge uncertainty and complexity, and hence the need to acknowledge that migration cannot be tightly regulated, cannot be controlled, but it's rather a question, like the notion that we should use is that of mass management rather than the idea of, as I was saying, safe, orderly and regular migration. Now, speaking about resilience, actually there have been some academic debate. I'm not sure how much it has been a policy debate about what does systemic resilience look like in a post-pandemic world, and what have we learned from the pandemic, and particularly for what concerns migration and mobility, because one thing that the pandemic caused was like the borders closing, how can I say, mobility stopped in ways that we would never have imagined it could happen. So Certainly resilience, I mean, we're all familiar, and it's a very neoliberal term. Resilience has been used a lot in relation to welfare discussions to say we people need to be resilient. We need to, find our solutions by ourselves, be entrepreneurs of ourselves. But I'm thinking here about a more progressive notion of resilience that speaks of the resilience of a system and how the system needs to adapt to changing circumstances. And that's why actually I distinguish between, not me, the literature distinguishes between situated resilience, which is kind of the smaller local resilience of readjusting the ways you do things, structural resilience, which means reorganizing, again, the way you do things, completely reorganizing what different components, for instance, do. So if we're thinking about kind of a system of production, you reorganize who does what. And if we're thinking about systemic resilience, we need to reform, we need to rethink the way we do things. And that is my question. What does systemic resilience look like in migration governance, and how do we achieve it? So I think the pandemic has shown to us that many aspects of our migration governance are not resilient. For instance, we've seen many countries that were dependent on seasonal migration for their agri-food sector, for both agriculture and food processing. And we've seen, you will remember in spring 2020, charter flights going different places, including Canada or Germany, Italy, and elsewhere. And we have also been discussing whether, it is how much we should be, we should be dependent on international supply chains. We've seen, however, also migrants being very important as workers in frontline sectors. So migrants being resilient to boost the resilience of the system. There we can also, of course, think that to the extent that, for instance, people can circulate within a wider area, like say, for instance, happens in the EU, that's a resilient system because it allowed for people to circulate even under pandemic times. So, and the question I think that arises is whether we're talking about resilience as a function of migration. So for instance, recruiting from abroad, or resilience of migrants as being more adaptable or more resilient themselves because they're more constrained by their circumstances. And I think that is, of course, a valid question that we can ask ourselves about Canada and the way migrants have been crucial, and asylum seekers too have been crucial in care work and also in the agri-food sector. Now, so that is what I want to think about and consider when I'm talking about a sustainable migration governance. So first of all, let me say a word about what I mean by saying we need to decenter our migration governance. And I see different levels of decentering. So one way of decentering that's probably the most obvious is decentering geopolitically, which means paying less attention to the perspective of destination countries and pay more attention to what happens also in countries of origin and in countries of transit. And I think there is, certainly in the scholarly literature, there is an awareness that all countries are implicated in migration in different ways, as emigration, immigration, and transit poles, not just as destination or just as origin countries. But I think the way we portray the countries in our, how can I say, universe of thinking about global governance of migration has to do more with power relations and with where the country is situated. And I use the example of Italy, Turkey, and Nigeria, who are three countries where Italy is understood generally as a destination country, Turkey as a transit, and Nigeria as an origin. And the truth is all three are implicated in different processes. So for instance, you'll have both economic migrants and asylum seekers arriving in Italy, but you have also many Italians moving abroad, and both to EU and non-EU countries. And among the people who come to Italy, some will stay and some will transit. But still, our imagination of Italy is mostly as one of as a host country for migrants. And Turkey, for instance, was a country that was, of course, a country of origin and an emigration country where people were living mostly to go to Europe. But It was also, we knew it was a transit country where some people, for instance, or a destination country, but in a smaller role, as people, for instance, from Central Asia would move to Turkey to find jobs for a period of time. We've seen Turkey emerging as a big host of asylum seekers in the last decade. And it's actually one of the top 5 countries in the world in terms of the size of the asylum seeking population that it's hosting, as it hosts 3.5 million Syrians. And yet, when we think of Turkey, we don't think of Turkey as mainly a destination country. And now, if I turn to Nigeria, which is actually a demographic and economic powerhouse in West Africa, and it's a very important country for regional migration flows. And I want to remind us all that among migration happening in West Africa, 80% of this migration flows happen within the region. So we tend to think Nigeria is a country of origin for Canada or for Europe or for the United States. But Nigeria is a very important destination country, or a country where people circulate, for instance, engaging into entrepreneurship, trade, such activities that require cross-border movement within the region. So at the end of the day, I think we need to decenter our perspectives and realize that all countries are faced with complex situations, and all countries have different interests. And it's important also to think that as policy actors, countries are not unitary actors, because they have, even within themselves, very competing interests. Now, speaking again about the decentering and the competing interests within a country brings me to the discussion of how can we decenter our understanding of actors. Because oftentimes, and of course at the formal global governance level, the spotlight is on governments, on national governments and on states. But we have seen, particularly in relation, for instance, to the Mediterranean refugee emergency in the mid-2000s, like in 2015-16, but also in the Venezuelan crisis and in a number of other cases, that it is important to pay attention to non-state actors. And there I'm thinking of both local actors like NGOs, but also international organizations that are playing an increasingly important role. And I'm thinking of the IOM having joined the UN organizations in 2016 and now branding itself with a totally new role and new importance. But I'm also thinking about transnational civil society. We have seen, particularly, for instance, in relation to the Mediterranean refugee emergency, we've seen several NGOs that were coming from one country, but having operations in different countries. So coming from the Netherlands, working in Spain and Greece, coming from Canada or the US, and people being active in both Italy and Greece or in the Balkans. So I think this is an important element to keep in mind. And of course, we need to keep in mind the connections with the private sector. And when I think of the private sector, of course, I'm thinking about the employers, but I'm also thinking about the wider set of actors that are involved in migration, from banks and money transfer businesses to real estate agents, travel agencies, lawyers, education institutions. In Canada recently, we've been paying more attention to international students and the whole business around international education. So we need to decenter our approaches and acknowledge that migration is not just about state regulations and state sovereignty over a territory. And there are many actors that are relevant, that are stakeholders, and many of these actors are not national, they're local or transnational. So I think when we think about the global governance of migration, we need to keep in mind that it is complex and that states are important, but not the sole actors, and that we also need to decenter our approaches to non-West-centric perspectives. Because important migration realities are happening in the regions, and we can learn from them more rather do this kind of navel gazing of what are we doing in North America specifically, or what are we doing in Europe specifically. Now, going back to my critique of the global, the global compact for refugees and the global compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration, my problem with them, and particularly with the global compact on migration, is the very reluctant acknowledgement there are things in migration that we don't know, and there are things that we don't know. So this is where I use the notion of uncertainty that has been developed generally in policy studies in other sectors, And I want to emphasize that uncertainty is different from risk, because we live in a risk society, as Ulrich Beck said nearly 30 years ago. So risk, of course, is about a threat, that something that can change and can threaten our existence. But the notion of risk is a notion that is tied to the idea that we can calculate the probability of something bad happening to us, and we can prevent the risk or we can mitigate it. So it is something that we have under our control. It can be something negative, but we have ways to address it. While uncertainty is precisely accepting that we cannot control things, and there are things that are outside our purview, they're outside of what we expect and what we can prevent. And there can be no calculation of probability of them happening, because sometimes we don't even know that something might happen. And there is a very interesting literature about this that I think we should bring closer to our study of migration governance. And speaking of this, let me speak a little bit about Migrant Agency. We've seen also, I think in the last 10 years, a lot of thinking going into the decision-making and the role of agency, particularly as regards irregular migrants. And I think the idea there was that, how is it, I mean, it was coming from a real life puzzle. How is it that so many young people, for instance, from Asia or Africa, are risking their lives in very complicated and risky journeys to get to their preferred destination? And oftentimes, again, people who are not researching migration asking themselves, but is it possible, like, the one would knowingly put their lives at risk, you know, drown trying to cross from Libya to Italy, or suffer horrible abuses in Libya and elsewhere, or even arriving in some European country and suffering really inhospitable conditions. And that's where I think in our understanding of how we can govern migration, we need to pay more attention to human agency, to how people make their decisions. And also, again, I want to emphasize here the notion of uncertainty. So in the Western world, we're used of having control of our lives and thinking that we can predict things and we can keep things under control and we can have our plan and try to act upon our plans. But in other places in the world, there's much more acceptance of uncertainty. And actually, I'm thinking of this notion that was used by a sociologist. I think her last name is Thorsen. And she was studying young West African migrants, trying to go towards North Africa and Europe. And she used this notion of hopeful uncertainty versus hopeless certainty. So she said, for these young men, uncertainty was pregnant with possibility. Uncertainty was potential. It was a good thing. While staying where they were, they thought this was a hopeless certainty, because they felt they couldn't realize their dreams and their aspirations if they stayed there. So I think it is important also to open up our understanding of human agency and think of the importance of hope and possibility and when people deciding. And also there's very interesting research that has shown that people often resort to self-deception. So even if they know they have information, well, first of all, they don't have perfect information, but even when they have information about negative things, they process this information in a biased way, and they say, it will not happen to me. So I think that this is important in our understanding of how can we govern migration, how also, if you want, how policies interact with migrants as human agents. So when I want to speak about my messy approach, I'm thinking that we need to rebalance our understanding of the world and think that there are multiple centers and multiple peripheries, and we need to look into those and not remain so West-centric, not remain so much host country or destination country focused, because this is something that I have seen also in my small involvement in some of these works, whether at OECD or in the Global Forum on Migration and Development, where there is, in the negotiations and in the talks, there's a clear dividing line between the destination countries and the origin countries. And I think we need to move on, to move beyond this view. We also have seen, as I said, how important are civil society actors, both local and transnational. and we need to engage those. And I'm saying this also mindful that in Europe in particular, there's been in the last at least 5 years a clampdown on NGOs, particularly in the Mediterranean, and an effort to discredit what they do. So this is important to keep in mind when we try to analyze governance. And then speaking again about how we should understand, uncertainty and managing migration. Rina, this is my last slide. I want to say that we should privilege a notion of mass management instead of control. And I think what is important is that politicians should speak up about it, because the problem is that governments, I believe, are aware that they cannot tightly regulate migration, but they still privilege a rhetoric towards the citizens of saying, don't worry, we got this, we got it under control, and the good migration is the safe and orderly one. And I think there should be more acknowledgement that migration governance is a moving target, and we need to engage with non-state actors, and we need to acknowledge that we don't have everything under control, and that would be a better and more equitable way of governing migration. So hence my notion of a messy approach, and I'll stop my sharing.
Thank you so much, Anna, for this very succinct summarizing of your theorizing on messy approach, and also your critique on the global compact on migration, which anyone who's worked in migration would and has done fieldwork would know that there's nothing called safe, orderly migration. It's always messy. There's a lot of migrant agency, as you've talked about. So before I go on, I encourage everyone to post their questions on the Q&A, and then I can take it up forward. When you were talking about, I really like the whole discussion and the focus on resilience governance, as well as acknowledging that there is what we call hopeful uncertainty. I really am drawn to that phrasing, where, knowing how South Asian men take huge risks to their lives to migrate to Greece and their desire to move on to other North European countries. So, I just want to bring the discussion to Canada, even though you did say, we need to move beyond North America and Europe. In the last few years, we've had a lot of media discussion about temporary foreign workers program or seasonal agricultural workers program. In here, how do you envision a systemic reshaping of migration governance, particularly of low-class migrants? I'm just curious.
Oh, I have very strong views about this, and probably against the current a little bit in Canada. No, certainly. Okay, I want to acknowledge, and I'm not I want to acknowledge that Canadian immigration policy has reacted in very, so in many ways, in very resilient and innovative ways, or at least innovative for what normally happens in Canada. So facilitating transition. So we've seen many innovations. So immediately in the summer 2020, extending status to the end of the year for people who were having trouble renewing their status. And then we've seen facilitations of transitions, both in terms of kind of casting a very wide net through the Canadian experience class for people who are temporary here and becoming permanent, and then the special 90,000 positions, etc. What we're missing, though, is a structural element, so something that is ongoing. And I want to think that the pandemic has shown that the previous system was probably exactly very regulated. So it was certainly it was predicated in the idea that in Canada we can control everything thanks to our geography, because having 3 oceans and the United States. And I think there has to be more flexibility, and I think there certainly has to be a consideration that a resilient and sustainable migration governance cannot only look at the interest of Canada. It has to recognize, a moral and political, in the wider sense, political obligation towards people who are with temporary status, but for a certain number of years here, or people like in the seasonal program who have been returning to Canada for, say, 8 to 10 years, or 6 to 9 months per year in this country, and we cannot say they are temporary. And I know people will come back with the argument, yes, but if we make them permanent residents, they're not going to stick to agriculture and they're not going to be competitive in the labor market. And that's, I mean, I have my answers, but I don't want to take too much time. But I want to say this, and I also want to say that, for instance, what we can learn from other countries is how much migration is a function of the national state. So in West Africa, borders have been very permeable. The EU action in West Africa and the pandemic has made the borders much less permeable. And I believe this is the same for some borders in South Asia. And I think we need also to keep that in mind when we're thinking about the governance of migration.
Thank you. And sorry for posing that question. I was just really curious, given that, we have so much of that discourse happening in the media. We have two questions here. Let me just take on one and ask you. One person asked, can you comment on the diffusion of strict anti-immigration policies to countries that are traditionally pictured as origin countries, but that also have large immigrant or refugee populations?
Yeah, I don't know which country you have in mind, but certainly this is not to say that, for instance, I don't know, I can think of Turkey as an example, but I can think also of an example like Ecuador, or actually I think Latin America is a good example, because I think, of course, I'm not saying the Venezuelans are having an easy time, but at the government level and at the national policy level, most countries have, kept the free movement regime within Mercosur. And for instance, Brazil has given, despite its, right-wing and populist government, has given stay permits to Venezuelans, and many countries have acknowledged their legal status almost automatically. At the same time, of course, we see the rise of very xenophobic and racist discourse. And for instance, Ecuador, that has so many immigrants abroad, does not, there is no, I've seen this in Southern Europe too in the 90s, where these countries were particularly immigration countries, and we're having a whole lot of diaspora policies, and the whole national identity was also built with this diasporic element within. And then when they started receiving migrants in significant numbers, the connection was not made. So our migrants are the good migrants, but these guys are the bad migrants. So yeah, it is true that countries do not seem always to make this connection.
Thank you. And then there's another question that's posed by Prashamsha. Sorry, I'm mispronouncing your name, to you, talking about how there's less discourse on how global compact on migration is destination country centric, which is what you addressed, but they're talking about Nepal and how it undermines and stigmatizes irregular migration in Nepal. So, they're taking the example of Nepal, but I think it could be transposed to other countries where, there's that huge stigma that's attached to what we call not that safe, orderly, but what you're calling about the sudden, messy migration, which gets labeled as undocumented or irregular or illegal migration. But then that fuels the economic underbelly of jobs in destination countries.
Yeah, I think my concern, and again, I want to emphasize that I don't think we should do away with the global compacts, because I think it's better to have them than not to have them. And it has pushed to acknowledging that not just asylum, but also migration is a transnational issue, and that we cannot solve it with bilateral agreements. On the other hand, I believe, and of course it's clear, this was the political imprint from the participating governments, that migration has to be safe, orderly, and regular. But it is almost like saying the reason why migration is not like this is the fault of someone. Someone who is responsible, who is guilty of not making. And I think that is what I think we need to recognize, is that I don't think all migration can be regulated, because we humans are so dynamic and unpredictable. And even like this safe and orderly migration is also probably premised in a notion of cost benefit. So thinking that migrants are making a cost benefit analysis that is pretty rational. And we know, I'm sure you and I know, and perhaps several people in this virtual room from our own research, but from others' research as well, that it's what I said, precisely the hopeful uncertainty, the notion, well, a lot of things, relative deprivation that is elevated to a different level these days, because we don't compare just with our neighbors and with our relatives and our friends. We compare with people who live in other countries. We compare with influencers and, with the star system of previously it was YouTube, now it's TikTok. So we have this relative deprivation elevated at a different level, and that's what motivates people. So it's a combination of very dynamic factors. It's not that people sit down and make a calculation, I'm earning X. And we know this for all migrants. We know that the people who move are not the poorest of the poor. They are people who have certain resources, both material resources, but also, if you want, networks that will help them facilitate this migration. And there is something that motivates them that I think often is not captured in the policies.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you so much for asking. So there's another question by Lara Aluko, who says, thank you very much for the presentation, and they are curious to hear your thoughts on what decolonial approaches can be applied to immigration practices in some global north countries. Recently, an article was published about how applicants from certain global south countries are kept in limbo for years through extremely slow processing, while applications from other global north countries are processed faster. How can governments be more equitable and fairer in their immigration practices?
Yes, thank you for your question. I have to say, that this is very different in Canada, particularly even I think compared to the United States, compared to my own knowledge and expertise on European countries, because precisely for this geographical issue that Canada is so insulated that it can relatively tightly regulate. And while I totally agree with you, while in theory the policy is clearly laid out, and if you want, is a policy that is, I call it skills is the new race. So it's racist on skills. So if you're highly qualified, you do your paperwork, you fulfill your things, and then you'll be admitted. And then we see what you say, that it's not a level playing field. And I totally acknowledge this, that because for many reasons that are, of course, structural and systemic. So that, for instance, if you're a French-speaking migrant from Cameroon, you have a much harder time getting to Canada than if you're a French speaker from France. Because if you want, there are so many, for instance, bilateral agreements with provinces about recognition of skills or recognition of professional qualifications. So certainly, and even we've seen this in things like the parents and grandparents provisions. And we know that new immigration to Canada is mostly, for instance, from Asia, different parts of Asia. And we know that people want to bring their parents and grandparents. And while Canada is a welfare state in many important ways, they say, oh, no, you shouldn't be bringing your parents because they will be a burden for us. But that's totally unfair. And it is racialized because we know that it affects some families and some communities more than others. On the other hand, I think so for instance, in Europe, where borders are more permeable and a lot of migration happens, just because people vote with their feet, they just move. And unless you are an authoritarian country, you cannot fully control your borders. And people also come as tourists with visas, and then overstay. And you have perhaps a different kind of inequity. So people arrive, but of course, when they try then to move to another status and stay or regularize, the how can I say, the colonial or post-colonial aspect creeps in as well. But I think in Canada, for me, and it's I believe I can offer this kind of insider-outsider perspective, it is very peculiar to our geography.
Thank you.
This feeling that we have.
Thank you. I really like what you said about skills as the new race, especially with the point system and how it's stacked, especially with the language criteria. But I also know when we talk about bordering regimes, how we wear borders on our bodies. and how race is a very important factor. So for even those who maybe migrate to or who come to Europe as tourists and then decide to stay on, they are still marked as the other. There's that racial profiling that happens much more for them than it would if it were someone else. And so it's like being in Canada and you might be here for generations, yet you'll always be burdened with the question, where are you originally from? Whereas the same would not be asked for someone who just arrives newly from France and lands in Montreal. They just merge in smoothly. But going on to another question, Mehrunisa Ali asks, accepting uncertainty essentially means loss of control or power. How would you convince former colonizers of Western states to accept diffusion of their power or letting go? I think it's almost a Freudian choice right now here.
Yeah, thank you, Michael, for your question. Well, first of all, I want to say something about what you said, Rina, about visibility, and I've become much more aware of that in Canada than I was living in. Like, I'm originally from Greece, so living in different European countries, and I tell my children here because I think that they're not aware, although we had discussed it in the past, but yeah, of course, when I start speaking, people know that I'm not Canadian or I was not born and raised here. But before I do, I would pass as an Anglo-Saxon Canadian. And these are, different layers of, and of course, in Canada, we wouldn't say, where are you from? We'd say, what's your background, right? And of course, for instance, in Southern Europe, people would not be politically correct. They would say, where are you from? And even if you have a local Italian accent, and they would say, yeah, okay, but what's the story? Where are you really from? And they wouldn't think, they would say, what's the problem? Why is this a problem that I'm asking? I don't know what, I want to hope that we're in Canada, and I would say also in several European countries, we are engaging with that. And we can hope that every generation does a better job. I want to thank you, Mehru, for your question. And actually, it gives me also the opportunity to complete my answer to Lara's question, because Lara, you were asking also, how can governments be more equitable? And I didn't answer that. So I reflected the problematic. And certainly for governments to be more equitable and fair, they would have to accept uncertainty and lose control and power. I think, for instance, that's part of our reckoning, that we live in a world where the balance of power is shifting. It's certainly shifting away from the West. I think Britain is having a hard time accepting this in its role in the world, but also the United States will be having a hard time. So, I think that's part and parcel. So migration is part and parcel of wider socioeconomic transformations and political transformations happening. And same certainly for Europe, starting to think Europe is not the cradle of civilization, is not the center of the world. Actually, it's just a tiny dot somewhere. But I think it is important. Yeah, I know it's not easy, but I think it is important because we need a sense of history, like a sense of critical reflection on who we are, where we come from, and where we're going. And I'm not sure how I will convince them. Perhaps one way that one can convince them for better immigration practices and policies, to say the ones that we have are often ineffective and inefficient, and they have a high human cost, both, for instance, in lives really lost, but also lives wasted, or capability and skills and talents that are wasted.
Thank you. We're ready. I'm open to having a couple more quick questions. It's 12:54. Just for everyone, we should be ending at around 12:58 or 12:59. So please feel free to put your questions on the chat, and I'll take this opportunity to slink another question in. Given that, so we have a question there, but let me slink what I was going to say. The Global Compact has been there for 4 years now. How do you envision other actors to play a role rather than just the destination countries? How do we decenter the framing of the global, compact in a fresher way? How do you envision that?
Well, first of all, yeah, I'm really looking forward to this year and to see what's happening in the run-up to, because for those who are not familiar with the technical details, so the Global Compact for Refugees has been meeting every year, because having the UNHCR as the main agent coordinating the works, the idea was that straight on after 2018 they would be meeting so in December 19, it was an in-person meeting. I think December 20 was virtual, and I'm not fully sure. I think the December 21 was hybrid. So it has been working, and the emphasis has been in strengthening the capacity of neighboring countries in crisis regions. And we see really a little bit this, of course, an acknowledgement that we need to support refugees, but an idea, okay, can you keep them in the region and we are going to help you? In the Global Compact for Migration, the road has been much more, much more tentative and longer, because from the beginning, the idea was that this UN migration network that had been created in parallel with IOM as the secretariat would then coordinate regional consultations, and the first meeting would only take place 4 years later, so now in December 2022. So I really want to see, and there's been now coming up some reports from think tanks saying, oh, there's been progress on this and this objective versus the other. And that the Global Compact for Refugees has 4 main objectives and the Global Compact for Migration has 23. And some of these are very technical and some of these are very political and very kind of aspirational. So it's a very uneven and complex document. I think one question is, as I said, that these compacts were for a world of hypermobility, and now we live in a world of very constrained mobility. And for instance, we've seen that countries that relied on seasonal migration, like North America, Canada in particular, and several countries in Europe, have been trying to come to terms with that. But we've seen also places like Singapore or the United Arab Emirates, who were relying to temporary, not seasonal, but temporary migration and a churning of migrants continuously, and they have been faced in a very abrupt situation. Same thing, like countries like Nepal have been faced with a huge return migration flow that they were not predicting and expecting. And I think it's easy for us researchers to say, oh, Nepal should be doing a better job. That I don't know how realistic is that. So I'm looking forward to see how there will be hopefully a turn away from the idea that temporary migration is the good solution, because you don't have to integrate anyone, but you can have labor when you want it, where you want it. So it will push, I think, for more ethical governance. And at the same time, I think the pandemic has shown that exactly we need to move away from Eurocentric and West-centric perspectives, because we are also dependent there, like to other world regions. And just a tiny answer to Boyd about your, being a Greek, and Greece believing it's the cradle of European civilization, hence the cradle of world civilization. I very much feel for this question. It's extremely interesting for me. I both feel sometimes proud and also ashamed that people maybe have been studying Aristotle in Iran or in Brazil, and we have not been studying their great thinkers. So I think we need certainly a rebalancing in that. So yes, continue to study European or whatever ideas that were born in Europe, in non-European cultures, but also recognize more of the ideas that come from other cultures in Europe and North America.
Thank you so much, Anna. We are 12:59 right now, and I can see Warren saying, we need to pack up, people need to go to their work. It has been really wonderful to hear from you. And just a quick reminder, the talk will be posted on next week. Warren, over the floor. Thank you once again, Anna, and I hand the floor to you now, Warren.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Anna. Thank you, Rena, for putting together this talk. Amazing thoughts. a lot of really, really thoughtful questions. There was a question about, do we post these talks? We absolutely do. They are recorded and they're posted to our YouTube channel, and you can get to that through our policy talks link. I put a link up in the question and answer function. So with that, I do want to thank you all for taking part. It's great to see you out, and I hope that you'll come back for our next talks next week. Thanks again. Have a great day.